Welcome to the Taiwan Take. I'm your host, Emily Waiwu. Today, we speak to Alejandro Mayoral Baños, Executive Director for AccessNow, which is a digital rights group. Alejandro is an indigenous activist and scholar based in Canada. He grew up in Mexico as a member of the Mixtec indigenous peoples. In 2015, Alejandro founded the Indigenous Friends Association to bridge the gap between indigenous communities and digital technologies. He has been named an Oshaka Fellow for his work as a social entrepreneur. And in 2020, he was named a Toronto Community Champion by the Canadian broadcasting company, CBC. We will talk about how to think about human rights in the digital age, Alejandro's journey as an advocate. He will also talk about his current work at AccessNow. But to begin, we will first talk about RightsCon. RightsCon is an annual summit that is the world's largest digital human rights conference. This year, it takes place in Taipei in February. Welcome, Alejandro.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for today. So let's first talk about the big summit that's coming to Taiwan. It's the 13th edition. It's the biggest ever.
Yes, exactly. So RightsCon is the world's leading conference on human rights, especially in the digital age. So basically, we are going to have different stakeholders that are talking about how human rights are impacted with all these technologies that are coming out. And nowadays is so important because we see how the platforms are affecting our lives as individuals, as community, as a society. And it's so important to continue fostering these type of conversations with different stakeholders. We are very excited about Taipei because, of course, Taiwan is an example of a democracy in the region. And we are really excited about the civil society, the vibrant civil society that is based in Taiwan. And since we were just exploring the idea of going to Taiwan, the civil society, they have been very engaged. They have been very welcoming of an event of this category in Taipei. And what we see also is a key moment for the digital rights movement globally, and especially with the geopolitics and everything that is going on in that world. That is so important how actually digital technologies require to be aligned to a human rights approach. So that's why we are very excited about this event that is happening at the end of February in Taipei.
So it's 4 days of programming, 5 separate tracks, 5 different stages. Last year, the edition that took place in Costa Rica, there was about 8,000 plus attendees, I think. Is that right? Offline and online?
Yes. And RightsCon Costa Rica, that actually was in 2023. It was June 2023. 2024 was a key year for us to really rethink the event and how we want to continue fostering the conversations in 2025 and onwards. One important factor is in this occasion, will be more than 550 plus sessions happening over the 4 days. So commonly there are around 14 to 18 sessions happening at the same time. So it's very exciting to see, the evolution and how actually people are meeting with each other. And also a lot of the spaces that are being created in RightsCon. It's so special to see that the action doesn't happen just in the sessions, but in the aisles, in the common spaces, because that's where you meet people. When you are having lunch with a partner, when you meet a funder, when you meet a government representative, and when you can have that approach, that friendly approach, very open. On this occasion, we already have more than 3,000 registered participants, and the in-person version is going to be the largest of all. We are seeing also the increase on the online participation in this last month. A lot of the online participation will pick up, but we see that the community is very vibrant and actually very excited to meet in Taipei.
I think for the past several months now, I've been hearing from a lot of people who work in research or NGO. They say, "Oh, we're coming to Taipei in February," and I said, "Oh, you're coming for RightsCon, right?" So there's definitely been this buzz about it, and I'm really excited to attend and check it out. And in a moment, I want to ask you about panels that we should be looking out for. But before that, I want to ask you about tech and policy in general. So RightsCon began as a conference in San Francisco in 2011. It was called the Silicon Valley Human Rights Summit.
Yes.
That year, in 2011, the headline of the year was WikiLeaks and Arab Spring.
Yeah.
Now we fast track to 2025. It's a very much complex world that we're in now, right? Countries everywhere are talking about countering information manipulation and interference, especially during elections. Meta has said recently that it will end fact-checking programs. TikTok in the US is hanging on a lifeline. Australia will soon enforce a new law to ban children under the age of 16 from accessing social media. So this is a lot of changes. We're in a very, very different world now. So talk us through, how do you think about this? How are you thinking about this personally, but also collectively about what we're facing in 2025?
Oh, yeah, of course. First, I will talk in general about the ecosystem. And of course, if you allow me, I will connect to the conference and what we will see about that in the conference. First and foremost, I think we are very clear of the authoritarianism that we are seeing in the non-digital world now is being transferred to the digital world. So we see a lot of governments, national governments, forcing a lot of different tactics on citizens and this idea of surveillance and checking on people, and anyone that goes against the national governments commonly are being repressed through the different digital means. And this has been expanding and expanding and expanding. Now, instead of and this is very interesting, when we started talking about the Arab Spring, was the opposite. Like the digital world was that idea of freedom, that idea of now we are going to be able to have a two-way communication with our representatives, with our governments. But now we are like evolving in something on the contrary. Like there is no two-way conversation with the government. It's the way to government to actually pick on me. And actually those free conversations that we envision now, that is changing. So that is a first thing that we need to start thinking about. The second thing is data is the new oil. Before, a lot of these extractive industries that were extracting a lot of resources from the nature, now they are being transformed in this, digital technology space companies that basically they extract the data not from the nature but from all citizens. So how data has been propelled as a way to create profit, not as a common good or as a common way to improve our lives. So this is creating a new narrative, because basically I can do whatever I need to do to get your data. So this propels a lot of conversations about data governance and privacy. So it's a very complex topic. We cannot go to the extremes because many different consequences of the extremes. Because if we go a completely closed environment, that actually it starts increasing the value of the data, and people start being more reactive and violent to get this data. But a totally open access to the data also creates, disparity of who gets the benefit of profiting from that data, right? So with digital authoritarianism and this data as the new oil, that creates a new perspective. And I think something very relevant for all of us is 2 days ago, the inauguration day in the US. I don't want to focus in the conversation in the US, but it's important because a lot of the digital tech companies are based in the US. So a highlight of that day is that besides Trump, like the big tech CEOs were beside him. So what we are talking is that now we are talking about a new techno-feudalism where tech companies are very close to power. And now we see that in many of national states. A lot of these companies have way more power than national states. They can change an election. If they start putting a ban or a filter in their platforms, you can change the willing of the people, through all these social media engagement. So really now we are in a very complex, environment that requires more the engagement of more civil society and more people, because the answers are not easy. And finally, I would say the third big issue that is very relevant is, of course, artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence, of course, we can talk for hours about artificial intelligence, but I think it's this idea that we want to replicate the intelligence of humans. And it goes to this philosophical question: how much do we want to advance in that setting? Because then are we trying to replace humans? What is the purpose of getting to that level? What is the end goal? And apparently there is no an end goal. There is just improvement and improvement and improvement and improvement. So of course, what are the consequences in our lives, in humans, and of course in human rights? Because if you don't need humans anymore, well, you don't need human rights either. So this creates a very dangerous narrative, and how actually we can gather and start organizing a civil society to tackle these issues. Now, with these big three topics, digital authoritarianism, data as the new oil, and artificial intelligence, I can tell you that RightsCon is precisely a very important convening space. Convening space, I could say, and foremost, is a civil society space. So it's really to bring like all these different organizations that are all types, all sizes, coming together to realize what are the common threats, what are the common opportunities in these complex topics. Commonly, of course, we have limited resources as civil society. So really using this space in many different ways to connect to others and trying to articulate new tactics with the complexity that we have nowadays. And also an extra layer on that is, of course, we are the civil society, but of course the presence of governments, the presence of companies, and how we can have a conversation, a multi-stakeholder conversation, to try to start creating new approaches. A lot of people are always asking us why you are inviting companies if you are fighting the companies. And we say because we need to talk to them. We need to engage with them. We cannot just reject them, because if not, we are not going to be able to create changes. And especially with all these trends that I just explained. So that is a little bit of what I see in what is going on in the world, and how relevant RightsCon is for these issues.
Yeah, that's a lot of set of problems and challenges that you're trying to address in 4 days. So from the program, I'm seeing it's not just civic society from across the world: Africa, South America, South Asia, the US, and so on, Canada, where you're based.
Yeah.
But it's also companies like Microsoft, IKEA, Meta, of course, the Alan Turing Institute. I thought that was very cool. And Wikimedia Foundation, that's also been long being in these conversations. But also several foreign ministries of different governments, from Germany to Ukraine, Finland, Sweden, and so on. And also many United Nations agencies. It's very cool, very, very ambitious. So what are you most excited about for those in those 4 days?
Oh my goodness, many things. I think, of course, first is all the sessions that are going to be happening. we saw the the excitement of our community. We received more than 2,000 proposals for the event.
Wow.
So it was hard, but at the end we needed to pick, as I mentioned, 550 plus sessions, and a lot of them are really, really exciting. Just to give you a hint, of course, all the program is online for your audience. You can go online on RightsCon.org, and there is a tab for the program. But I can tell you that, for example, in one big thing is the Taiwanese participation. So there is going to be a very interesting dialogue, for example, with Global Voices, Dancing Media, and other stakeholders about Taiwan and Ukraine, the media dialogue, what happened with the war in Ukraine, and what is happening between mainland China and Taiwan. So a lot of the commonalities, the differences, and a lot of what can be the different approaches on that. That is a very interesting one. Also, a very interesting conversation about youth engagement, advising rights, and gender equality in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. In the region, how all these democracies are tackling these issues. And what I really like is the civil society is taking the lead on this, and really portraying this collaboration that sometimes in the past, and especially with the history of the region, has been very complex. But civil society, I think they are an example of what can be done together, right? So that's on the size of Taiwan, but there are other very exciting things. For example, there is several sessions about LGBTQ plus, for example, in the MENA region, and how a lot of activists in the region are using the platforms as a way to, protect and advance the rights of a lot of queer individuals in the MENA region. um, how very connected to this, how a lot of activists, queer activists, are fighting digital authoritarianism. So it's not just about their identities, but how they are resisting digital authoritarianism. And it's really exciting to see that in, for example, in African countries, where we see right now, the trend of going backwards in a lot of the human rights around LGBTQ communities. So it's very, very important to highlight these type of convening spaces and sessions. Finally, I could say there is one major highlight, and we hope that we can continue fostering this with several governments, is countering commercial spyware. I think a lot of national governments now, actually, we are using that idea of digital authoritarianism and about that security that a lot of national governments are using as a way to say, hey, spyware is a way to go against human rights. So, and if you want to protect your national sovereignty, you need to be very, very combative and against commercial spyware, because commercial spyware basically allows anyone in the world to spy on citizens and in many different national interests. So it's really interesting to have these type of conversations. I'm very excited about that. And I think also we are going to have several satellite events, of course. Having all these convening space is also an opportunity for a lot of civil society actors to convene, to organize, to foster and showcase what they are doing. And an example that I want to highlight: we are going to have a conversation with more than 50 executive directors of civil society organizations before the event, where we are going to be talking about these topics. What are the challenges that we are seeing in the ecosystem? Of course, the obvious shrinking of the funding around human rights across the globe, and how we can articulate in a way that we can support each other. and especially with everything that is going on and all the geopolitics that are happening in today's world.
Yeah, you touched on two of the things I really wanted to ask you about. One is fundraising in this year, where budgets everywhere are shrinking, but also a lot of the programming here is very progressive in a very good way, but also some places we're seeing policies rolling backwards.
Yeah.
How worried are you? Just today, for example, several hours before we spoke, President Donald Trump of the U.S., he just made an order ordering all of the federal staff members of the federal government who work in DEI initiatives to go on leave, effectively shutting down DEI efforts in federal government. This is just one example, and this is happening in different countries as well. How worried are you?
Emily, I'm not gonna give you an answer because that is one very complex question, and this is something that we are still talking as civil society. I can tell you that I have been personally engaged in many conversations, and now what we saw in the past commonly, it was that certain regions or just certain governments were having that approach, but then you have other regions that are like on the other side. However, this specific year has been very different because now it's everywhere. Like, in 2024 was the biggest election year of the history of humanity. So sadly, for a lot of us, the overall results, were moving a lot of the governments to the far right, and actually counteracting everything around human rights and about DEI efforts, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So it's clear for us. It's clear for us that we are the enemies of. And I know that it's a heavy word, but I think there has been very clear movements of all these governments to push back like the efforts of civil society that we have been pushing for a human rights perspective for a long period of time in many different topics. I think and partially what we are finding is how we can make sense of a human rights approach with our new priorities.
Mm.
And this is a little bit difficult, and because of course the as I mentioned before, how they are highlighting the national security, the cyber security, all this, how we can actually bring the human rights narrative as central when you are talking about cybersecurity. This has a lot of different angles, and we are still developing those. How we can bring the perspective of human rights in something like cybersecurity. I think that besides what is happening, and I know that Trump has made several decisions against climate change, but I think we are all experiencing the consequences of climate change. We cannot deny climate change is in front of us. We don't need now scientific articles. We are seeing the changes in the climate. I think even the far right governments in many other regions have been fostering the conversations about climate change. So how important is bringing the conversation of digital rights and human rights in digital technologies? How to connect that to climate? How these affect the environment? And how this, if we don't take an approach on human rights in the digital, this can affect the environment in the long term. So, with that being said, this is a little bit of how we are trying to tackle this very challenging environment that we are facing. I can tell you that it's happening everywhere, and really, that's why a lot of people are really excited about RightsCon.
Yeah.
because it's gonna be a brainstorming space as well. What
Yeah.
we haven't thought, and what is the possibility of that creative space together. And I think that is I know that is a big responsibility, and this is what a lot of the team members have expressed, that this is a big moment for civil society, and sadly in this 2025 environment is going to be key for what is coming after.
A lot of the civic society who are presenting from around the world are very established organizations. They've had years of track records, decades, and so on. What do you, in today's environment for 2025, what would you recommend for new civic society, new NGOs that are just still at the very grassroots level, who are not at RightsCon
Yes.
in February in Taipei, but they're also seeing this trend that we talked about across the world. They're also seeing the budget cuts. They're also seeing some of the very aggressive pushback against human rights. What do you say to young organizations?
I think the first and foremost strategy that I'm gonna share with a lot of them is don't isolate yourselves. I think more than ever is so important to be in a network. So like being very proactive of connecting with other players, with other organizations at the local level. What are the different networks that are already on the region, or in the country, in the city, to start articulating ways of collaboration? That is very important, and especially for the dissemination of information, because even that you have access to the internet, the amount of data that is available is very overwhelming. So being in this network, in these networks really provides a filter of all this information and highlight what is relevant for your cause, relevant for what you are doing. That is I would say that is one big advice that I provide, and something that I always say for people that are starting on this. It's a difficult journey. So being connected in a network is not just about work, but also to being able to share how you feel and the challenges that you are facing as a person, as community, within your organization. To have these networks of support are really, really important for the long-term sustainability of any initiative. That would be the first part. The second part is, and I know that this can be a little more difficult and entails way more resources and thoughts, but civil society, I think we need to start thinking about new ways of sustaining ourselves. And I'm talking here directly on financial sustainability. I think when we start and when we are, and I can share that it was part of my journey in Mexico. I had very good intentions, and I have all the passion inside me, and I saw the problems, and I really wanted to jump in and trying to support a change. But it's so important that from the beginning you start thinking about how we can start diversifying, different ways of revenue within your organization, not to become rich, not to create profit, is just to sustain in the long term. And I think we need to start really thinking about new ways of doing it. I think the traditional, non-for-profit, ecosystem now is being very limited by all these different actors and everything that we have been talking about. And of course, the needs are increasing. So of course, the available resources are very limited for the demand. So really, we need to start developing new strategies. And this new strategy means to start exploring new ways of doing your work and providing an income for and especially thinking about the long term. I have seen a lot of initiatives failing on that because, as I did, very passionate about the cause, very passionate, but not thinking about how to sustain that in the long run. And it's so important to start creating that resiliency. And finally, and this could be my third big part for people that are not able to travel, to do international traveling, or to do like participating in an international conference, is always try to continue learning, the capacity building, and now the resources that are available. You can get them many online, and it's so important that you start getting track of what is going on, especially in social matters and and the complexity of the ecosystem today. It's so important that we have an understanding on very diverse group of topics. Maybe if you are an engineer, if you're a technical person, you need to get a little more trained in human rights, on what is going on, what is the geopolitics of the world. And on the other side, if you are in the geopolitics, in the human rights, in the development sphere, you need to get about around tech and understand how tech works. To have this interdisciplinary approach is so important to tackle these issues. Now, as I have mentioned, there are a lot of complexities around, so it's so important to have all these visions. So I would say that those three are my advice for those that are just starting to create change in this world.
Find your network, find new ways of financial sustainability for civic society, and continue capacity building.
Yes.
I think those things. I think those things coming from you carry a very big weight, because for you yourself, let's turn to your journey now.
Yes.
You've been it's been about 18 years now as
Yes.
an advocate and researcher for indigenous rights.
I think, and just to give a little bit of context, when I was in high school and
In Mexico.
In Mexico, I was I was raised in Mexico, born in Mexico. So my perspective was, I was a geek. I was always around computers. So my life was about video games, was about programming and always being in front of a computer. Socially awkward, I was not like that person that was always out. On the contrary, I was always at home playing video games or in the computer. So for me, since I was in high school, it was clear that my career was gonna go around computer science. So even in all these tests, professional career, professional tests, like the counselor of my high school told me, Alejandro, computer science, there is no other option for you. So it was clear for me that that was going to be my path. And of course, a lot of what, as a young teenager in Mexico, of course, I want to work in a big company like Google, like Apple, that was always the vision, right? But what happened? and is that in my journey, in my university, we needed to do this service learning. That basically it was a community service as part of your credits. As a side activity, is like besides your academic credits, you need to do these social projects. So this is when I just started traveling to the countryside of Mexico. And at that time, the mobile penetration was very low, was still like very in the early stages of mobile penetration. So going in the countryside means you don't have access to the internet, or very limited access to the internet. So perfect.
This would be the early 90s.
No. It was actually early 2000s. Yeah, early 2000s. So when I was in those years, yeah, one or two people in maybe 1,000 people had a cell phone. So and the cell phones, those old cell phones without internet, right? So really the connectivity was really limited. And then this is where I started seeing the other perspective that I am talking about. being always in front of a computer, and then seeing a lot of the complexities of community, and the potential of communities, and communities working together, especially in rural communities, how actually they collaborate in order to like tackle all the issues that they are facing, right? Of course, there are high rates of poverty in those areas. So how they tackle a lot of the needs around them. So that's when I started learning a lot of the importance of community, the importance of, being connected to your roots, being connected to the land as well. And of course, this is where I started learning from several elders and knowledge keepers, a completely different worldview, a completely different worldview, a
Were they
completely way
from
to do.
your
Oh, oh
groups?
no.
So, different groups. Okay.
Yeah, it was a different group. So in my case, especially for the dynamics, it was very difficult to actually start working with my own community, because the family dynamics and the history of the society dynamics, sometimes it plays a role.
Interesting.
So I started with the Totonac, that is on the other side of the country. Um, and because also I was in university, that opened the possibility for me in this specific context. Oh, you are getting a university degree. Like, let's start talking. And from there, this is where I started like asking myself if actually Apple, Google, and those companies were the right place, and if they were doing the right thing. More as a common sense. It's not that I had a background or a training, or not at all. It was just that to see the contrast. It was really very interesting. So while I was advancing in university, this is where I really started like seeing this more as a way of organizing ourselves, and actually start connecting a lot of the activists within the university to these communities. So as a young teenager, I started organizing groups in the university, and that's when we started doing more and more and more and more. And I remember even the authorities on my university, they were, Alejandro, stop. You shouldn't be doing this. Like, remember, you're a student. You shouldn't be
Wow.
actually organizing communities. But that's where I'm a little bit of stubborn, Emily, or perseverant, I could say. But this is where I started seeing the potential of civil society. That even that I didn't know what civil society was, I was being part of those group of citizens organizing ourselves just to a collective common good. And from there is where I started my first NGO, a local organization working in Mexico, working with indigenous communities. And that's where my journey started. And it was, at that time, there was no digital at all. It was just focusing on the digital, the economy of the communities. And it was really fostering a lot of, for example, women rights. A lot of the women in the community, they wanted to have their own income without relying on the husbands. So it was really focusing on what they wanted to continue developing. On that is when I started really grasping the challenges of civil society, applying to grants, getting funds, asking for a donation, all these dynamics. Um, and when this started in 2007. In 2014, after 7 years being in the space, is when I had the privilege, and I always say it was a privilege for me to come to Canada, to start my master's program. I got a scholarship, and my program was about interdisciplinary studies, and actually the decision factor of coming to this program was, if you studied something but you are doing something else as your work, this is a place for you. And I was like, okay, this is the time that I want really to explore indigenous worldviews and digital technologies. Maybe the answer is that there is no connection. Maybe the answer is no. There is the two things need to be completely, opposite. But that's when, I came to Canada as a newcomer, as an immigrant, also experiencing like that part of being an immigrant in a new country with a different language, with a different culture. And trying to find my community is when I started participating as a volunteer in a lot of indigenous urban communities here in Toronto. I started being part of several groups. And after 6 months, the elders and knowledge keepers asked me about creating an app. Alejandro, if you want to start a project, why you don't start an app? And I remember, Emily, that I replied, but I don't know how to create apps. And they were like, Alejandro, that's your journey. You need to learn by
Figure it
yourself.
out.
Yeah, that's part of that's the technical background that you need to bring. You can learn about apps, and we can bring that knowledge or that community perspective. And that's where we started this initiative of creating an app to bring indigenous students in post-secondary educational institutions to come together as a social media platform, right? An alternative social media platform. And Emily, that's where we realize of a lot of different things that were happening in this space, and that there are many topics that we have never explored in the digital. And basically, I can talk for hours about this because after the master, I did a PhD about this, so I can talk hours about.
It was called the Indigenous Friends app.
Yes, Indigenous Friends app that actually became the Indigenous Friends Association because we created another NGO now based in Canada working on these issues, because we realized that there was a lot of different things and a lot of ways to connect indigenous rights to digital rights, and how it's so important to start bringing the indigenous perspective into digital technologies. Why? It's when we started seeing the strengths of indigenous worldviews. Because going back to my story on learning from elders and knowledge keepers on the community level of that community work that doesn't translate into profit, but translate to a benefit for the community. So, and how so it's so important that every time that you are like constructing or building up something for the community, you are acknowledging the land, you are acknowledging the environment. So all these principles were very important to start thinking about those principles when you are creating software, when you are creating a digital platform, how you are bringing that community aspect to the software, how you are bringing the environment to that, and how you protect the data as well. Those resources of the community, how like the community are very protective as a collective, not one person, not the chief of the community is the one that protects, it's all the community. So we realized of a lot of different principles that were so important, and also about the infrastructures. And this is where we started this initiative of the Indigenous Friends Association that first started with the app, then the association, when we realized that there is a lot of potential of solving a lot of the issues of digital tech, bringing the indigenous perspective. And we started an education program to bring more indigenous youth into tech and bringing that perspective into the creation of technology. It was not just about representation in the tech sector, but more about how it's so important to bring worldviews, these perspectives, when we are developing software, when we are developing hardware, and especially with everything that I mentioned before, these perspectives when we are creating a social media app, for example. And just very, very beautiful story and full circle of this story is being in this initiative in 2018. Through one of my funders, I was invited to a global event in human rights in the digital age called RightsCon in Toronto.
There you go.
There you go. Yes. And in 2018 was my first RightsCon. And I didn't know what RightsCon was, but, this funder in Toronto, RightsCon was in Toronto, invited me to go to this event that was happening. And he wanted me to connect to different stakeholders. And I said, why not? And then my journey to now jump to now at the global level, like meeting other indigenous activists that were also working on the space and pushing for change in digital tech. So it was really interesting in 2018. Now jump to that community. And since then, I participated in every single RightsCon, including Costa Rica in 2023. And well, now I'm in a very different position. Now leading this organization that organizes RightsCon Access Now. But this is how my journey ended here, and how I'm in front of you today. And this is a little bit of my story.
I want to say it's a really nice story, also because it just ties together so nicely, right? From your time as a high school student and college student, going to the rural areas of Mexico and finding out different ways of working with the community and realizing that you have this superpower, this tech ability, or at least a tech mindset if you didn't know yet how to build the app,
yes.
Which will later be a challenge kind of presented to you. But at the time, knowing that, this mindset that you have might be a new way of unlocking something that might help the community, to then you finding a new home in Canada and really embracing the indigenous communities in Canada. So around the world, the global indigenous population is about 6%. Your work prior to joining Access Now has totally been dedicated to digital rights and indigenous affairs. So can you give us a view of what is the state at the moment for Indigenous affairs and digital rights? Because as a part of Indigenous Friends Association, you guys worked a lot with education, with employment. You've had a lot of initiatives. You work with the Justice Department of Canada. Also was on a working group that's monitoring the United Nations Indigenous groups. So this is a very broad area that you're working in, right? So, but just coming back to digital access for the Indigenous community, what is at the present the most priority?
I think I would say three main points, Emily. And of course, each of them has many different variances and, of course, more discussions inside. But one is really how these educational programs are actually aligned to indigenous worldviews. I have seen in many different countries a lot of digital training programs for indigenous communities to get into the digital world, to tackle the digital divide and all that. But I always say that digital divide is not about just providing access. It's about providing control and ownership of the infrastructure and the information. And that requires to actually adapt a lot of these educational training programs to indigenous worldviews. So there is a lot to work there. How to, going back to that example where I saw the two things separately, now to really merge both of them. And that means requires a lot of work, because there is an effort from technicians to actually be more open to indigenous worldviews, but also indigenous worldviews, how they can start integrating tech into a lot of their ways of being and ways of knowing. That's the first one. The second one is about land rights and digital tech. So how actually a lot of the land claims and a lot of the problems that are being faced by a lot of indigenous communities regarding land are connected to digital technologies, and how actually these big tech companies and all these servers actually are correlated to these land rights. So it's so important that we start connecting the two different movements together. And the third one that is a big part, indigenous data sovereignty. That it has been a big part of a lot of discussions in a lot of different outlets, how actually in digital technologies we can start protecting and giving back the data that is owned by indigenous communities. This extraction of data started with colonialism, started 500 years ago, But now with digital tech, this has been fostered and is going, faster than ever. So how we can actually support, that data governance for indigenous communities. I think those three topics are on the top of the agenda for a lot of indigenous movements around the world.
And for a technologist who's creating something new, where would you recommend them look up? Maybe there's a guideline, or maybe there are some questions that they must ask themselves in order to make sure that they are protecting all populations as they're creating a new technology product.
Oh, yeah. There is a lot, several resources. First, there is the Global Data Alliance, the Indigenous Data Global Alliance, that created the CARE protocols. The CARE protocols is around indigenous data sovereignty, and what are the ethical principles that need to be integrated when you are creating any type of data related. It can be a software, it can be a database. How following these criteria, you are actually protecting indigenous data rights. Also, there is a big group of indigenous AI, and like how actually you can start creating different AI models and respecting indigenous rights. What are the principles to follow? And these two groups are very open for conversations. And of course, and just to connect back, RightsCon is we are going to have an indigenous working group where we are going to be continue fostering these conversations, and very, very open to have more stakeholders that are willing to understand how to integrate this into their designs.
Perfect. There was a question I really wanted to know about. There's a particular tech initiative that you brought from Mexico to Canada, but I think we're running out of time. So I think maybe we can catch up with you after RightsCon and do an update again. But before we leave, aside from RightsCon, what should we be looking forward to from Access Now?
Oh, in Access Now, I think with a lot of the measurements that were announced by the U.S. government, and again, it's not that we want to be centric on the US, but this will affect the entire digital technologies ecosystem. We really need to start, we are going to be way more active on the tech accountability. And what does that mean from a government's perspective and a company's perspective, and really bringing human rights aligned to this human rights approach. So you will see after RightsCon our work to be continued in the region, but more importantly around tech accountability. And this is something that I think is very relevant for what is happening today. And of course, just a hint for the community, we are looking forward to have RightsCon in 2026. So for everyone that is listening, we are going to be announcing, the region where the RightsCon 2026 is going to be. So I'm inviting everyone to tune up after RightsCon to hear more about it.
Exciting. Thank you so much. So RightsCon 2025 will be in Taipei for 4 days starting February 24th.
Yes.
So it will be the first time in East Asia. Very exciting. We'll have the link to the registration page and also the links in the show notes to the resources that Alejandro, you just spoke about for tech developers. Anything else you wanted to add before we go?
Just to thank your audience, and very exciting to have everyone in RightsCon in Taipei. See you then.
So thank you so much, Alejandro, for joining us today. This has been the Taiwan Take. I'm Emily Waiwu. We're based in Taipei, Taiwan. This is Ghost Island Media. This episode was made with help from Zach Jiang and also edited by Wayne Tsai. See you next time. Ghost Island Media.